The maps changed, not slowly, not through gradual correction or improved surveying techniques. They changed deliberately, systematically, as if following instructions no one bothered to write down. Between 1770 and 1820, the largest territory on Earth vanished from cartographic record. Not conquered, not renamed, erased. Tartaria. The name itself triggers an almost reflexive dismissal in academic circles. A geographic term, they'll tell you. A catch-all label for the unknown interior of Asia. Nothing more. But that explanation requires believing that European cartographers, sophisticated enough to map coastlines with remarkable precision, suddenly became vague and imprecise only when labeling the largest landmass on their charts. That they drew borders, marked cities, indicated royal courts, all for something that supposedly didn't exist as a cohesive entity. The evidence suggests something different, something coordinated, something that required resources and authority operating at a scale that officially has never existed. Start with the maps themselves. Pull up a French atlas from 1750. There it is, Grande Tartary, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Not a blank space marked unexplored. A labeled territory with internal divisions, trade routes, population centers. Now look at a French atlas from 1820. The name is gone. The territory has been divided among Russia, Qing China, and various regional designations. No explanation, no transition documentation, no historical event cited to justify the change. This wasn't unique to French cartography. Dutch maps show the same pattern. British maps, the same erasure. Russian maps, perhaps most tellingly, show Tartary existing alongside Russian territory, then gradually being absorbed without any documented military campaign, without treaty records, without the kind of evidence that typically accompanies territorial acquisition on such a massive scale. The coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. These weren't competing mapmakers working in isolation. These were rival empires, nations that went to war with each other, nations with contradictory political interests. Yet somehow, across all of them, the same decision was made within the same narrow window of time. Remove Tartaria. Redraw the maps. Provide no explanation. That kind of unanimity doesn't happen accidentally. It requires communication, coordination, agreement at the highest levels of power. It requires a reason compelling enough that competing empires would cooperate, despite their mutual hostility. And it requires enforcement. The ability to ensure that cartographers, publishers, encyclopedia editors, and academic institutions all fell in line. The official explanation collapses here, because if Tartaria was just a vague geographic term, why would its removal require such coordination? Why would anyone care? Why would Russian, British, French, and Dutch authorities all independently decide that this particular label needed to disappear from maps within the same generation? Unless it wasn't independent. Unless someone was giving instructions. Look closer at the cartographic evidence. The maps from the transition period, roughly 1780 to 1810, show something fascinating. Tartaria doesn't vanish all at once. It fragments. Some maps show it split into Tartary Chinoise and Tartary Ind-Fe Pendante. Others divide it into Petite Tartary and Grand Tartary. It is as if the map makers were testing different approaches, trying different methods to make the name disappear gradually enough that no one would question the change. But even more revealing are the maps that show corrections, literal cross-outs and overwrites. Tartaria scratched out, Russia written above it. Tartarian cities relabeled with Russian names. Borders redrawn mid-atlas, sometimes in different ink. These weren't updates based on new surveys. These were political decisions being implemented in real time, visible in the cartographic record for anyone willing to look closely enough. The British Library archives contain several of these transitional maps. So does the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. They're not hidden, just ignored, because acknowledging them means acknowledging that something systematic was happening, that this wasn't natural cartographic evolution, but coordinated historical revision. And then there are the mapmakers themselves. Several kept journals, maintained correspondence, left records of their work. In the early 1800s, some of them began expressing confusion in private letters. Confusion about why they were being instructed to remove labels they knew to be accurate. Why certain territories were suddenly off-limits for detailed mapping. Why questions about Central Asian geography were being discouraged by their patrons and publishers. One French cartographer, whose name appears in archive catalogs, but whose published work has been largely forgotten, wrote to a colleague in 1803 expressing frustration that his detailed maps of Tartarian trade routes were being rejected by publishers who had previously commissioned such work. He noted, with obvious bewilderment, that the same publishers were now claiming there was no market for such maps, no interest in regions that, just a decade earlier, had been considered essential knowledge for anyone involved in Eastern trade. What changed wasn't geographic knowledge. What changed was what people were allowed to know. The trade route question deserves closer examination. Because Tartaria wasn't just a political entity on maps, it was a commercial reality. The Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting East and West, ran directly through territories labeled as Tartarian. European merchants, Russian traders, Chinese commercial agents, all of them dealt with Tartarian intermediaries, paid taxes to Tartarian authorities, conducted business in Tartarian cities. These weren't abstract transactions. They were documented in customs records, merchant ledgers, trading company reports. The Dutch East India Company maintained detailed records of their overland trade routes through Central Asia. British trading houses documented their interactions with regional powers along the Silk Road. French commercial agents filed reports about market conditions in interior Asian cities. And then, over the same narrow period when the maps changed, these commercial records undergo a curious transformation. The word Tartaria begins to disappear from trading documentation. Cities that were previously identified as Tartarian ports or Tartarian trading centers get relabeled. Commercial agreements that mention Tartarian authorities are recopied with different regional designations. The business records rewrite themselves to match the new cartographic reality. This wasn't a matter of correcting geographic errors. Merchants care about accuracy. They need to know exactly who controls which trade routes, which authorities collect which taxes, which cities offer which commercial opportunities. The transformation of their records suggests something other than improved knowledge. It suggests coordinated revision, pressure from above to align commercial documentation with the new official narrative. Some of these original trading records still exist in company archives. They're rarely examined, rarely cited in historical research, but they preserve evidence of a commercial network that made no sense without Tartarian intermediaries. Trade volumes that can't be explained by direct Russian or Chinese control of Central Asian routes. Commercial relationships that required neutral territory that officially never existed. Now examine what happened to the encyclopedias. The Encyclopædia Britannica, 1771 edition, contains entries on Tartary describing it as a vast region inhabited by various peoples under different governments. Not a unified empire necessarily, but a recognized geographic and cultural entity. By the 1820 edition, the entry has changed. Tartary becomes a historical term, something that existed in the past, something that European travelers once called the interior of Asia before better information became available. The French Encyclopédie follows the same pattern. Early editions describe Tartary in present tense. Later editions shift to past tense, then drop the subject entirely. The shift happens without acknowledgement, without explanation of what new information prompted the change. The entry simply rewrites itself as if the earlier version never existed. This is historical revisionism operating in real time, not a correction based on new discoveries or improved understanding, A coordinated rewrite across multiple reference works, multiple languages, multiple nations. Someone decided what the official narrative would be, and the institutions of knowledge production complied. Who had that kind of authority? Who could compel encyclopedists in London, Paris, Amsterdam, and St. Petersburg to all revise their entries in the same direction? Not a single government. These were rival powers. Not a scientific consensus. No new evidence was cited. Something else. Something operating above the level of individual nation. States. The publishing industry itself provides clues. Many of the major encyclopedia publishers in the late 1700s and early 1800s shared something in common. They were funded by the same financial networks, backed by banking families with connections across European capitals. The Rothschilds, the Barings, other financial dynasties that operated internationally, despite national boundaries. These weren't just investors. They sat on editorial boards, influenced content decisions, had the power to determine which reference works got published and which got suppressed. When you trace the funding sources behind major encyclopedias from this period, you find the same names appearing repeatedly, the same financial interests, controlling what constituted official knowledge across multiple countries. This explains how coordination could happen without explicit conspiracy. The people funding the encyclopedias were the same people funding the royal houses through loans and financial arrangements. They had a direct interest in maintaining narratives that legitimized existing power structures, and they had the institutional leverage to ensure that encyclopedias, atlases, and academic publications all told the same story. The architectural evidence adds another layer, because while the maps were being redrawn and the encyclopedias rewritten, something else was happening. Massive neoclassical buildings began appearing across the world with suspicious uniformity. St. Petersburg, Vienna, Washington, D.C., Buenos Aires, Melbourne, buildings that supposedly represented the triumph of European civilization spreading across the globe. But here is the problem. These buildings share more than aesthetic similarity. They share specific technical features, proportion systems, construction methods, decorative mathematics. The kind of precise replication that suggests not independent construction, but a common source, not European culture spreading outward, but existing infrastructure being reattributed. Stand in front of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Now stand in front of Schattbrunn Palace in Vienna. Now the Forbidden City's outer buildings in Beijing. What do you notice? Not just similar styles. Identical mathematical relationships governing spatial proportions, the same ratios between height and width, the same principles of symmetry, the same architectural language. This isn't coincidence. This is transmitted knowledge, specific technical knowledge that doesn't appear in any construction manuals from the period. Knowledge that seems to predate the supposed builders. Knowledge that suggests these structures weren't built by the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, or the Qing dynasty. They were inherited, claimed, reattributed. And that is where the timing becomes critical. The same narrow window when Tartaria disappears from maps, 1770 to 1820, is the same period when these architectural reattributions occur. When buildings that were already standing get assigned new construction dates, new architects, new origin stories, when the physical evidence of a previous civilization gets absorbed into the narrative of European colonial expansion. The pattern repeats worldwide. Buildings appear in cities that were supposedly frontier outposts just years earlier. Construction timelines that make no sense given the available technology and labor force. Photographs from the late 1800s showing completed structures with no documentation of the building process. No records of the massive workforce required. No contemporary accounts questioning how such rapid construction was possible. What we have instead are dedication plaques with convenient dates, opening ceremonies celebrating European achievement, and official histories written decades later by people who weren't there. The buildings themselves tell a different story. They tell a story of inheritance, not construction, of reattribution, not creation. Consider the specific case of St. Petersburg. Official history tells us Peter the Great founded the city in 1703 on marshland, building it from nothing through sheer force of will and tens of thousands of conscripted laborers. But when you examine contemporary accounts, strange details emerge. Travelers to St. Petersburg in the 1710s and 1720s describe finding ruins of previous structures. Stone foundations that predated Peter's construction, architectural elements that had to be worked around rather than built upon virgin ground. These accounts exist in travel journals and diplomatic correspondence. They're not secret, just ignored, because acknowledging them means acknowledging that something was already there. That St. Petersburg wasn't built from nothing but rather reconstructed, repurposed, claimed. The same pattern appears in other supposedly new cities from this period. Cities that official history claims were built rapidly in impossible timeframes. When you dig into contemporary sources, you find references to existing structures, to foundations already in place, to infrastructure that had to be adapted rather than created. The story changes from miraculous construction to strategic reoccupation. Now layer in the genetic question. Because if these European royal families were truly separate lineages evolving independently across the continent, we should see genetic diversity reflecting that separation. We should see distinct bloodlines corresponding to distinct cultures. Instead, when genetic studies are conducted, what appears? Remarkable genetic similarity across families that claim to have separate origins, shared markers suggesting common ancestry more recent than the official genealogies admit. DNA evidence indicating mixing with populations from Central Asia and Siberia, precisely the regions labeled as Tartaria on those old maps. The families themselves seem remarkably uninterested in comprehensive genetic testing. Despite their obsession with bloodline purity, despite their claims of divine right based on ancestry, they've shown no interest in using modern genetic science to verify their official family trees. Why not? What might that verification reveal? Here is what it might show: that the royal families of Europe aren't separate dynasties that occasionally intermarried. They're branches of the same ancestral tree. A tree with roots in the very territory that was erased from maps. A tree that needed to be obscured because it would reveal the inheritance. Reveal that these families didn't conquer and civilize. They simply claimed what was already there. The linguistic evidence supports this. Royal households across Europe maintained private languages for internal communication. Not Latin, not French, not the diplomatic languages they used publicly. Something else. Something described in vague terms as traditional or ancient. Something never specified in detail. What were they speaking? What language did they use when they didn't want their own subjects to understand? What linguistic heritage were they preserving behind closed doors while publicly claiming German, French, or British identity? The deliberate vagueness around this question is telling because language reveals ancestry in ways that official genealogies can hide. Language carries cultural memory, preserves connections that political narratives try to sever. And if these families were speaking a language from Tartaria, from the civilization that was supposed to never have existed, that would explain the silence. That would explain why linguistic practices in royal households are documented so poorly, despite the meticulous record, keeping in every other aspect of their lives. Now count the fires. Between 1650 and 1850, an extraordinary number of royal residences, government archives, and genealogical record offices burned. Not just the famous ones, the Royal Palace in Madrid, the Library of Congress. Dozens of smaller but critical fires destroying specific records at suspiciously convenient moments. Right before genealogical claims would need verification, right after territorial transitions, right when old records would contradict new official narratives. And after each fire, the reconstruction of records favored the newly established order, the newly documented bloodlines, the newly claimed territories. This is evidence destruction operating at scale, not a conspiracy in the sense of a single organized plot, but a pattern of institutional behavior. A pattern of ensuring that uncomfortable questions couldn't be answered because the documentation to answer them no longer existed. The Siberian question ties all of this together. Because Siberia, vast resource, rich Siberia, wasn't Russian territory for most of recorded history. It was labeled as part of Tartary. Then, in a remarkably short period during the 1700s, it became Russian. Not through documented conquest, not through treaties we can examine. It just became Russian. The official explanation claims gradual Cossack expansion, primitive local populations offering little resistance, natural and inevitable Russian dominion. But when Russian explorers documented their Siberian expansion, they described encountering cities, not villages, cities, stone buildings, organized populations, trade networks. Cities that don't appear in modern historical narratives, despite being substantial enough for contemporary Russians to note their existence. Where did those cities go? Who built them? If Siberia had an established urban civilization when Russia arrived, whose civilization was it? The answer that fits the evidence, the answer that explains the disappearance from maps, the architectural inheritance, the genetic similarities, the linguistic secrets, is the answer we're not supposed to say. Tartaria, not a vague geographic term, but a civilization. A civilization that built the structures we attribute to European empires. A civilization whose descendant bloodlines still rule but rule under new names, new genealogies, new official histories. A civilization that needed to be erased so completely that even questioning its existence triggers immediate dismissal. The secret council, if it existed, wouldn't have needed formal meetings or written charters. It would have operated through existing power structures, through the families who inherited Tartarian infrastructure and needed to legitimize that inheritance, through the institutions they controlled, the map makers they employed, the encyclopedists they funded, the historians they commissioned. The coordination we see in the cartographic erasure, the encyclopedic revision, the architectural reattribution. That coordination could happen naturally when the same families controlled publishing houses in multiple countries, when royal marriages created networks of influence spanning continents, when shared interest in maintaining the inheritance narrative aligned their actions even without explicit conspiracy. They didn't need to meet in shadowy rooms. They were already related, already in communication through the normal channels of royal correspondence, already coordinating marriages, treaties, and territorial agreements. Coordinating the historical narrative would just be one more item on the agenda, barely worth noting because the alternative, admitting the inheritance, admitting Tartaria, would undermine the entire basis of their claimed legitimacy. The evidence remains. The buildings they couldn't erase, the photographs they couldn't destroy, the maps they thought everyone would forget, the genetic markers they can't hide with modern testing, the patterns that emerge when you step back and look at the full picture instead of examining each piece in isolation. What was Tartaria? A unified empire, a confederation, a cultural sphere? The evidence has been too thoroughly scrubbed to say definitively. But it was something large enough to span continents, something sophisticated enough to build infrastructure we still use, something powerful enough that its erasure required coordination across rival empires, and something threatening enough that even now, centuries after it disappeared from maps, mentioning it in academic circles triggers immediate hostility. Not debate, not investigation, hostility, as if certain questions remain forbidden, as if certain truths must stay buried. The maps were redrawn. The encyclopedias were rewritten. The genealogies were reconstructed. The architecture was reattributed, and we're left with a historical narrative that requires believing in impossible coincidences, miraculous construction timelines, and coordinated silence across competing empires. Or we can believe the evidence that something was here before, that it was deliberately erased, that the people who erased it are the same people who claimed its infrastructure as their own, that the royal families of Europe are branches of a Tartarian bloodline that needed to hide its origins to legitimize its rule over populations that weren't their ancestors' people. The secret isn't that there was a council. The secret is that the council was the royal families themselves, operating in plain sight, coordinating through existing channels, erasing their own history to create a more palatable narrative, hiding inheritance behind claims of conquest and civilization. They changed the maps because the maps told the truth. They rewrote the encyclopedias because the encyclopedias preserved the memory. They burned the genealogical records because the records would reveal the bloodline. And they succeeded so completely that even now, pointing at the evidence triggers disbelief. But the evidence persists. The buildings remember even if we've forgotten. The DNA doesn't lie even if the family trees do. The patterns emerge even when institutions refuse to investigate. And once you see it, once you trace the architectural similarities, the genetic markers, the cartographic erasure, the coordinated silence, you can't unsee it. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed. The maps prove it existed. The question is why its existence had to be erased so completely. What knowledge did it represent? What technologies did it possess? What systems of organization did it employ? And why would revealing that truth threaten the power structure that has ruled for the past 2 centuries? The answers lie in the buildings we walk past daily without questioning, in the genealogies that stop at precisely the point where they'd reveal something important, in the maps that changed without explanation, in the encyclopedias that rewrote themselves, in the royal families that share too much DNA and too many architectural principles to have evolved independently. The secret council that erased Tartaria from every map wasn't a shadowy organization. It was the inheritors themselves, hiding the inheritance, claiming it as their own creation, rewriting history to erase their actual origins, and maintaining that erasure through institutional control that persists to this day. They thought we'd forget. They thought the evidence would fade. They thought new generations would accept the official narrative without question. But maps don't lie. Buildings don't lie. DNA doesn't lie. And patterns, once recognized, can't be erased no matter how many encyclopedias get rewritten. The civilization they erased from maps left traces they couldn't remove, and those traces tell a story that makes the official history collapse under its own contradictions. A story about who really built the world we inherited. A story we're still not supposed to remember. A story that explains why certain questions remain forbidden in academic circles, 2 centuries after Tartaria vanished from every map. The council succeeded in the erasure, but they failed to erase the evidence, and evidence, given enough time and enough people willing to look at it, honestly, always reveals the truth they tried to hide.